pro-Israeli lobby in the US is pushing for limits on the import of Iran's oil products as part of tougher sanctions Washington has already imposed on the country. Since Iran exports around 40% of its refined petroleum, this could seriously damage its economy. But some say it's not just the Islamic Republic which could be affected by these sanctions. Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by investigative journalist and RT contributor Wayne Madsen. Wayne, good to see you there in the States. Now, will this clearly have an impact on, well, we know this will clearly have an impact on the Iranian economy, but do you think these sanctions could possibly backfire and affect people in America?
Well, here in the United States, we're already seeing gasoline prices inching up back to $3 a gallon. So by imposing restrictions on any imports from overseas, including from Iran, it would, of course, possibly increase those gasoline prices even further. The backers of this particular legislation, Howard Berman, one of the co-sponsors, the co-sponsor in the House of Representatives, is strong support of the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee. His Senate colleague, Evan Bayh from Indiana, also is a supporter of AIPAC. And I would note that this all comes at the time that Dennis Ross, who was Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's State Department advisor on Iran, who was reportedly let go from that job because of his strong connections to the Israeli government, has now been picked up by the National Security Council, where he will have direct input to President Obama on Iran policy. Dennis Ross, of course, is a strong proponent of sanctions against Iran, a strong opponent of their nuclear program. So there's much more at play here behind this congressional bill to impose further sanctions on Iranian oil.
Well, Obama's certainly stating a very different approach, isn't he? I mean, what's your view of his position, saying that the US will not meddle with Iran's domestic affairs in the light of what's happened in the recent election?
Well, either President Obama is putting out a red herring there, or there is an absolute split on Iran policy within the Obama administration, with people like Dennis Ross on one hand, and people like Jane Harman, who has been the subject of a espionage investigation involving her dealings with an Israeli government official. She was caught on a wiretap. We've had the AIPAC involved in an espionage case, which the Obama administration has dropped charges against the two former AIPAC officials, and no jail time for their interlocutor from the Pentagon, retired Air Force Colonel Larry Franklin. So we've got different signals coming from the Obama administration on how to deal not only with Iran but Israel's influence over U.S. foreign policy. I would note maybe it's just a symbolism, but Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was behind the dismissal of Dennis Ross from her staff as one of her top advisors on Iran, fell and broke her elbow on a trip to the White House. There may be more symbolism to that actually than not. So we see a different group now, kind of very influential with Obama's policy towards Iran. He says he doesn't want to interfere, but what we see on the streets of Tehran might show otherwise.
So what you're saying, he doesn't want to interfere, but what's being shown in the streets otherwise? Are you saying then, perhaps agreeing with the speculation that there are external forces at work in the streets of Iran, and that in some ways I suppose you could compare what's happening in Iran with what we see or what we saw in the previous revolutions in the former Soviet countries, you know, for example, Georgia and Ukraine. Would you see any similarities there?
Well, in a recent statement before a closed committee of the Israeli Knesset, the head of Mossad, Meir Dagan, said that Ahmadinejad was clearly the favorite of the Israeli government because his re-election would basically provide the impetus for their hardline approach, their call for military action against Iran's nuclear program. So there's always the risk, and I think this risk has actually shown itself to be the case now, that people like George Soros, who funded those activities in Ukraine, Georgia, and elsewhere. We're hearing about the Green Revolution, and what may have been a mass protest without foreign interference may now be subsidized by the people like George Soros, where they're talking about yet another themed revolution. In this case, a green revolution, green armbands on members of the Iranian soccer team, green colors in the streets. So there's a danger if it's thought by Ahmadinejad and his supporters that there's foreign interference, that will only aid their cause in not having any sort of recount or any sort of cooperation between the present Iranian government and the opposition. The foreign involvement is a real poison pill here for the government of Iran.
Okay, Wayne, we'll leave it there, bearing in mind, of course, that there are calls for more protests in the streets of Iran today, so we'll see how developments unfold there. In the meantime, good to hear what you have to say here on RT. Thanks very much indeed. Wayne Madsen from Washington.